The European Union is facing an increasingly complex challenge in its economic and geopolitical relations with China. A new and troubling dimension to this relationship has emerged in the form of China's control over rare earths, a group of critical materials vital to modern technologies and industrial capabilities. From smartphones and electric cars to defense equipment and renewable energy solutions, rare earth elements play a crucial role in shaping the global technological landscape. For years, China has been the dominant player in the production and export of these materials, controlling a substantial portion of the world's supply. This dominance has put many countries, including members of the European Union, in a precarious position, dependent on China for resources that are indispensable to their technological infrastructure and economic competitiveness. Now, as tensions grow in global trade and political spheres, the EU is coming to terms with a harsh reality. It can no longer afford to be held hostage by China's control over rare earths. Stéphane Séjourné, the EU Commissioner for Industrial Strategy, recently sounded the alarm during a speech in Strasbourg, France, emphasising the need for the bloc to break its dependence on China. Séjourné's statement was sharp and direct. He warned that China's licensing process for the export of rare earths has become increasingly problematic, with Beijing attaching disturbing conditions to these exports. Specifically, he noted that the Chinese government has been issuing licenses for certain rare earth exports in exchange for industrial secrets from European manufacturers. Séjourné went so far as to describe this practice as akin to racketeering, a strong condemnation that highlights just how damaging China's tactics have become for European industries. This situation is not just an economic issue, it's a geopolitical one. Rare earths are a cornerstone of modern technologies. The materials are used in everything from the renewable energy systems that are central to the EU's climate goals to the defence technologies that ensure national security. As such, the EU's reliance on China for these critical materials has become a strategic vulnerability. By leveraging its control over rare earths, China is not only asserting its economic dominance, but also using its position to exert political and diplomatic pressure on European nations. The impact of this dependency on rare earths is multifaceted. On one hand, the EU's heavy reliance on China for these materials has allowed the bloc to access cheap and readily available resources that are crucial for its manufacturing sectors. However, this relationship has also placed European industries in a vulnerable position. As Séjourné pointed out, manufacturers seeking to secure licenses for the export of rare earths are increasingly being forced to share sensitive information about their technologies. This exchange of industrial secrets is not only an infringement on intellectual property rights, but also an existential threat to the EU's technological sovereignty. In many ways, the EU's dependence on China for rare earths is a microcosm of a larger problem: the growing strategic leverage that China holds over global supply chains. The country's dominance in the rare earth sector is just one example of how China is using its economic power to influence global markets and secure geopolitical advantages. This control extends beyond rare earths, encompassing a wide range of critical materials, technologies, and infrastructure that are essential to the functioning of the global economy. For the European Union, this growing imbalance is a matter of national security as much as it is an economic concern. The rare earths issue underscores the need for the EU to rethink its approach to global supply chains, particularly in sectors that are critical to its technological competitiveness and security. It is no longer enough to simply rely on external sources for key materials. The EU must begin to consider the long-term implications of its dependence on countries like China, especially as the geopolitical landscape becomes increasingly unstable. To address this challenge, Séjourné and other EU leaders are calling for the bloc to take decisive action to reduce its reliance on China for rare earths. This could involve diversifying sources of supply, investing in alternative sources of rare earths, and developing domestic capabilities to extract, refine, and recycle these materials. Such initiatives would help to ensure that the EU is no longer at the mercy of a single supplier and that it can maintain control over its technological future. However, this process is not without its difficulties. While China may dominate the global rare earth market, there are other countries that possess significant reserves of these materials, such as Australia, the United States, and Russia. The challenge for the EU will be to forge new partnerships with these nations and create a more resilient supply chain for rare earths. But simply finding new sources of supply is not enough. The EU must also invest in the technologies and infrastructure necessary to process and refine these materials. Without such investments, the bloc will continue to face significant barriers in reducing its dependence on China. In addition to sourcing rare earths from alternative locations, the EU must also focus on developing new technologies to reduce its reliance on these critical materials. Researchers are already exploring ways to reduce the need for rare earths in manufacturing processes, which could help mitigate the risks associated with supply chain disruptions. Furthermore, the EU could encourage the development of circular economies, where materials are recycled and reused rather than extracted from the earth. By investing in such technologies, the EU can begin to insulate itself from the vulnerabilities created by its reliance on foreign-controlled resources. The EU's approach to this issue must also be guided by its broader industrial policy. The bloc must strengthen its internal industrial capacity and protect its technological secrets from exploitation. As Séjourné's comments about China's practices make clear, there are serious risks involved in sharing sensitive industrial data in exchange for access to essential materials. This is not only a matter of economic strategy, but also one of national security. The EU must take steps to safeguard its technological edge and ensure that its industries are not compromised by external pressures. In the broader context of EU-China relations, the rare earths issue is just one piece of the puzzle. Over the years, the EU has been increasingly critical of China's trade practices, especially its use of state-backed enterprises to dominate global markets. These practices have raised concerns about fair competition and market access for European companies. The rare earths issue adds a new dimension to this ongoing challenge, as China's economic policies are now directly impacting the EU's ability to maintain a competitive industrial base. For years, the EU has relied on its economic ties with China to fuel growth and secure access to critical materials. But as China has become more assertive in its foreign and trade policies, it has become clear that this relationship is no longer sustainable. The EU must now find a way to navigate the complexities of its dependence on China while protecting its own economic and technological interests. This will require a careful balancing act as the EU seeks to avoid confrontation with China while also taking steps to reduce its vulnerability to the country's growing influence. One potential avenue for the EU is to increase its investment in alternative sources of rare earths. While this will require significant upfront investment, the long-term benefits could be substantial. The EU could also look to strengthen its alliances with countries that have access to rare earths and other critical materials such as Australia, the United States and Canada. By diversifying its sources of supply, the EU can reduce its dependence on any one country and ensure that it has access to the resources it needs to maintain its technological competitiveness. At the same time, the EU must continue to push for greater transparency in global supply chains. China's control over rare earths has made it clear that there is a need for more robust regulations and monitoring of the global trade in critical materials. The EU could work with international organizations to create new standards for the extraction, processing and trade of rare earths, ensuring that these materials are sourced responsibly and that supply chains remain open and transparent. Ultimately, the EU's ability to break free from its dependence on China for rare earths will depend on its willingness to take bold action. The stakes are high, not only for Europe's economy, but also for its geopolitical standing in a rapidly changing world. By investing in alternative sources of rare earths, protecting its technological secrets, and working to create more resilient supply chains, the EU can chart a course toward greater industrial independence and ensure that it remains a global leader in the technologies of the future. The rare earths issue is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the broader challenge facing the European Union. As the world becomes more interconnected and as China continues to expand its economic and geopolitical influence, Europe will need to take a hard look at its own industrial strategies and secure its place in the global economic order. It is no longer enough to simply rely on the status quo. The time has come for the EU to take control of its future, to secure its critical resources and to protect its technological sovereignty in the face of growing external pressures. In conclusion, the European Union's challenge with rare earths is emblematic of a larger struggle for economic and technological autonomy in a world where resources and power are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few dominant players. By taking action to reduce its dependence on China and to strengthen its own industrial base, the EU can pave the way for a more secure, resilient and competitive future. The stakes are high and the time to act is now. Increasingly, licenses are being granted in exchange for information that often and worryingly relates to industrial secrets. These requirements are also akin to racketeering if we consider all the demands made on our manufacturers in order to obtain these export licenses.
Ces exigences s'apparentent aussi à du racket. Si nous prenons l'ensemble des demandes qui sont formulées à nos industriels pour obtenir ces licences d'exportation,